Two low-level thugs thought they had the waitress cornered, laughing as she dropped her tray in terror. But they made a fatal mistake by ignoring the silent man in the corner booth. They didn't notice the tattoos crawling up his neck, or his 60-pound Pitbull uncoiling beneath the table, until the man finally stood up. By the time they realized they weren't the hunters anymore, the dog was already moving like liquid lightning. If this story pulled you in, make sure to hit that subscribe button so you never miss what's coming next. I've got another unforgettable story dropping tomorrow. And while you're here, jump into the comments and tell me where you're watching from. I love seeing our community from all around the world. Alright, let's get back into it. The moment Camilla Smith's voice cracked, the laughter behind her didn't stop, but the diner did. Forks paused midair. Conversations dissolved into silence. Even the fluorescent lights seemed to dim as her tray tilted in trembling hands, coffee sloshing over the rim and splashing across the checkered floor in dark, spreading pools. It wasn't clumsiness. It was fear, the kind that seizes your muscles and makes your breath come shallow and fast. Two men in leather jackets had her pinned between the counter and the vinyl stools, their bodies forming a wall she couldn't escape, their breath hot against her neck as they whispered threats that sounded like jokes to anyone who couldn't hear the venom beneath. Brantley leaned closer, his grin widening as tears welled in her eyes. He was enjoying this. The power, the control, the way her hands shook when he tilted his head and murmured something only she could hear. Something about remembering faces, about consequences, about how some mistakes follow you home. Carson's fingers dug into her forearm with casual cruelty, tightening when she tried to twist free. His laugh was low and mean, the kind that comes from someone who's discovered he likes hurting people and has stopped pretending otherwise. They were savoring this moment, believing this forgotten roadside diner was just another stage where no one mattered enough to interfere. They were wrong. They didn't notice the way silence spread outward like ripples on still water, claiming space around them one table at a time. The elderly couple by the jukebox had stopped eating, forks frozen above their plates. The trucker at the counter had gone rigid, his coffee cup halfway to his lips. Even the cook had paused in the kitchen window, spatula suspended, watching through the pass-through with wide eyes. And they certainly didn't notice the man seated in the corner booth by the window. Damian Davila sat perfectly still, dressed simply in a black suit with no tie, the top button of his white shirt undone. Tattoos traced the visible skin of his neck and crawled across the backs of his hands, intricate, dark, deliberate. He looked like someone who had walked through fire and come out forged rather than burned. His coffee cup lowered to the table with the soft click of porcelain on laminate, but his eyes never wavered, never blinked, tracking Brantley and Carson with the focus of someone who had learned decades ago how to disappear into crowds while missing nothing. He had the stillness of deep water, the coiled readiness of someone who understood exactly when patience ended and action began. At his feet, a gray Pitbull sat like carved stone, muscles visible beneath its short coat, a heavy chain collar catching the afternoon light. The dog's ears were forward, its body motionless except for its eyes brown, intelligent, utterly focused on the two men crowding Camilla. It didn't growl, it didn't shift. It simply watched with the kind of attention that precedes violence, patient and disciplined and absolute. Camilla's voice came out small and broken. "Please, just let me go." Brantley laughed harder, louder, as if her fear was the punchline he'd been waiting for. His hand came up to her shoulder, fingers pressing down with enough force to make her wince. "You should have thought about that last night, sweetheart." Recognition flashed across her face, raw and undeniable. Her eyes widened, her breath caught. She knew exactly why they were here. This wasn't random. This wasn't bad luck or wrong place, wrong time. This was revenge. Carson leaned in close enough that his stubble nearly brushed her cheek. "You remember now, don't you? That alley? Those flashing lights you just had to wave at?" Camilla's knees buckled slightly, but Carson's grip kept her upright, kept her trapped. Tears spilled down her cheeks, and Brantley tilted his head mockingly, his grin stretching wider. "We told ourselves we'd find you. And look, here you are, serving coffee like nothing happened." The diner had become a vacuum. No one moved, no one spoke. The only sound was the faint hum of the refrigerator behind the counter and the ragged hitch of Camilla's breathing. Brantley shoved her forward, not gently, not playfully, sending her stumbling hard into the edge of the counter. Her hip struck the corner with a painful crack, and the tray slipped from her hands entirely, clattering to the floor in a spray of broken ceramic and spilled coffee. She caught herself on the counter, gasping, her burgundy uniform stained dark down the front. "Lesson learned?" Brantley snarled, leaning over her. "Keep your mouth shut next time." That was when Damian stood. Not rushed, not dramatic, just Inevitable. He rose from the booth with the kind of deliberate precision that made time itself seem to hold its breath, unfolding to his full height in one smooth, controlled motion. The Pitbull rose beside him instantly, silent and focused, its body coiled like a spring. Damian's voice, when it came, was quiet and steady, yet it cut through the diner like a blade through silk, impossibly calm and utterly immovable. Let her go. Both men turned slowly, their grins still in place, sizing him up with lazy confidence. Just some guy in a suit. Just another customer with a dog. Nothing to worry about. Then they actually looked at him, at the tattoos crawling up his neck, at the way he stood centered, grounded, unshakable like someone who had decided something and wouldn't be changing his mind. At his eyes, cold and controlled and completely unafraid, holding a kind of quiet authority that made the air feel heavier. Brantley's grin faltered. Just slightly. Just enough. Carson's hand drifted toward the inside of his jacket, fingers seeking reassurance, seeking steel, seeking the thing that would make this problem go away. The Pitbull's muscles tensed visibly, every line of its body radiating a warning that bypassed language entirely and went straight to instinct. Not growling, not barking, just ready. Damian's gaze didn't waver. He didn't raise his voice. He simply repeated himself, each word falling like a stone into still water. Let her go. Carson's laugh came out, wrong, nervous, thin, strangled. He glanced at Brantley for reassurance, then back at Damian, his hand still hovering near his jacket. Then he made his choice. His fingers closed around something hidden beneath the leather, and he took one step forward. In less than a heartbeat, the world changed. Camilla had barely slept the night before. Every shadow on her walk home replayed in her mind like a horror film. Stuck on loop, the alley, the blood, the sickening sound of fists landing on flesh, the way Brantley's eyes had snapped toward her just before he ran. She'd tossed and turned until her sheets were tangled around her legs, her pillow damp with anxious sweat. And when morning finally came, she'd stared at her reflection in the bathroom mirror, wondering if she should call in sick. She hadn't. Because calling in sick meant admitting she was afraid. And admitting she was afraid meant accepting that what happened in that alley had changed something fundamental inside her. So she'd gone to work anyway, telling herself it was over, telling herself they'd never find her, telling herself that doing the right thing was supposed to protect you, not haunt you. She'd been wrong. The previous night had started ordinary enough. Camilla's shift had ended at 11, later than usual because Jenny had called in sick and someone needed to cover the closing duties. She'd locked up the diner, counted the register twice to make sure the numbers matched, and stepped out into the cool October air with her tips folded in her apron pocket and her keys already in her hand. The walk home was always the worst part of closing. 3 blocks through downtown, past the shuttered storefronts and empty parking lots, the streetlights casting long yellow pools that didn't quite reach the spaces between. She'd done it 100 times before. She knew which alleys to avoid, which streets had cameras, which routes kept her visible. But that night, she'd been tired, distracted, thinking about whether she had enough milk for breakfast and whether her landlord would finally fix the leaking faucet. She hadn't noticed the voices until she was already past the alley entrance. Low, angry, punctuated by sounds that made her stomach twist. Camilla froze mid-step, her keys biting into her palm. Every instinct screamed at her to keep walking, to mind her business, to get home and lock the door and pretend she'd heard nothing. But something, some stubborn, reckless part of her that still believed the world could be fair made her turn her head. The alley was narrow and dark, lit only by the glow of a security light 2 buildings down. At first, she could only make out shapes. 3 figures, 2 standing, 1 on the ground. Then her eyes adjusted. 2 men in leather jackets stood over someone curled on the pavement, taking turns kicking him in the ribs with methodical, brutal efficiency. The man on the ground wasn't fighting back anymore. He was just trying to protect his head, arms wrapped around his skull, body jerking with each impact. Camilla's breath caught in her throat. Her heart hammered against her ribs so hard she thought it might crack bone. Walk away, something inside her whispered. This isn't your problem. But the man on the ground made a sound, a wet, desperate gasp, and Camilla's feet moved before her brain could stop them. Hey! Her voice came out thin and shaky, barely louder than a whisper. The 2 men didn't even pause. One of them, the shorter one with a goatee and cold eyes, delivered another vicious kick to the victim's side. The sound it made was wrong, hollow and sharp at the same time. Hey! Camilla shouted louder this time, her voice cracking with fear and adrenaline. Stop it! Someone call. Both men's heads snapped toward her in perfect unison. For one frozen moment, they just stared at each other across the mouth of the alley. Camilla could see their faces now, the taller one with the sneer and the dark hair slicked back, the shorter one with the goatee and the kind of smile that made her skin crawl. Then she saw the blood on their hands. Panic flooded her system like ice water. Her keys slipped through her fingers and clattered to the sidewalk. She bent down automatically to grab them, her eyes never leaving the two men, and that's when she saw it. Flashing lights, red and blue, reflecting off the wet pavement at the far end of the street. A police car turning the corner 2 blocks away. Camilla didn't think. She just reacted. She stepped into the street, waving her arms frantically, her voice rising to a near scream. "Here! Over here! Help! Someone needs help!" The police car's spotlight swung toward her, bright and blinding. In the alley, the two men moved like shadows caught in sudden daylight. They scattered, one darting deeper into the alley, the other sprinting past a dumpster and disappearing around the back of the building. But not before the taller one locked eyes with her. Not before he marked her face, memorized it, filed it away. Not before his expression shifted from surprise to something far worse, cold, calculated promise. "You just made a mistake," his eyes said. A big one. Then he was gone, swallowed by darkness and distance. The police car pulled up beside her, an officer already stepping out, radio crackling. "Ma'am, are you hurt? What's going on?" Camilla pointed toward the alley with a shaking hand. "There's someone, he's hurt bad, they were beating him." The rest of the night blurred into statements and questions and flashing cameras. The paramedics arrived. The man on the ground was loaded into an ambulance, unconscious but breathing. The officers took her information, asked her to describe the attackers, promised they'd follow up, but by then, the men were long gone. And Camilla stood alone on the sidewalk, her apron still stained with coffee from her shift, her hands trembling uncontrollably, and a cold, heavy certainty settling into her bones. They saw you. They know your face. She'd walked home in a daze, checked every lock twice, pushed her dresser in front of her bedroom door, and lay awake until dawn broke through her curtains. And now, standing in the diner with Brantley's hand on her shoulder and Carson's fingers digging into her arm, she understood with perfect, terrible clarity. They hadn't forgotten. They'd come to collect. "You remember now, don't you?" Brantley's voice was silk wrapped around razor blades, soft and dangerous, spoken just loud enough for Camilla to hear. His hand remained clamped on her shoulder, fingers pressing into the hollow above her collarbone hard enough to leave bruises. Carson stood on her other side, blocking any path of escape, his grip on her wrist unrelenting. Camilla couldn't speak. Her throat had closed up completely, her vocal cords locked tight with terror. All she could do was nod, a tiny, jerky movement that made Brantley's grin stretch wider. "That's what I thought." He leaned in closer, his breath smelling of cigarettes and something sour. "You cost us a good night's work, sweetheart. Made us run like rats. Made us look weak." His fingers tightened. "That doesn't sit well with us." Carson chuckled, low and mean. "We've been looking for you. Took us a while, had to check 3 diners before we found the right one. But patience pays off, doesn't it, Brantley?" "Always does." Brantley's eyes glittered with malicious satisfaction. "And you made it so easy. Same route home every night, same little uniform, same pathetic routine." The words hit Camilla like physical blows. They'd been watching her, following her, tracking her movements like predators studying prey. The thought made her stomach churn with nausea, bile rising in her throat. "We thought about catching you on your walk home again," Carson said conversationally, as if discussing the weather. "Nice and private, no witnesses." But then Brantley had a better idea. Brantley's grin turned savage. "Why hide it? Why not make an example? Let everyone in this sad little diner see what happens when you stick your nose where it doesn't belong." Camilla's eyes darted toward the other customers, the elderly couple frozen by the jukebox, the trucker at the counter, the businessman in the booth near the restrooms. All of them were watching, but none of them were moving. None of them were helping. She was alone. "Please," she whispered, her voice breaking. "I'm sorry. I didn't mean, I was just trying to be a hero?" Brantley's laugh was harsh and ugly. "Heroes die, honey. They die bloody and forgotten. And nobody thanks them for it." He shoved her backward again, harder this time, sending her crashing into the counter. Pain exploded through her hip and lower back. "You should have kept walking." Tears streamed down Camilla's face now, hot and unstoppable. Her burgundy uniform was soaked with spilled coffee, the fabric clinging to her skin. The broken ceramic from the dropped tray crunched under her shoes as she tried to steady herself, tried to find some dignity, some strength. but there was none left. Carson moved closer, crowding her space, his face inches from hers. You know what the best part is? Nobody here is going to stop us. Look around. He gestured lazily at the frozen patrons. They're all too scared, too smart. They know better than to get involved. He was right. The diner had become a tableau of paralysis. The elderly woman had her hand over her mouth, tears in her own eyes. The trucker was staring down at his coffee like it held the answers to the universe. The businessman had his phone out but wasn't dialing, just holding it uselessly. No one was coming to save her. Brantley grabbed a fistful of her hair, yanking her head back so she was forced to look at him. The pain was sharp and immediate, making fresh tears spill down her cheeks. Here's how this works. You're going to apologize. You're going to beg. And then we're going to decide if that's enough. I'm sorry, Camilla sobbed, the words tumbling out in a desperate rush. I'm so sorry, please. I didn't know. Louder, Brantley's grip tightened, so everyone can hear. I'm sorry. Her voice cracked, rising to something close to a scream. Please, I'm sorry. Carson laughed, delighted. That's more like it. See how easy it is when you cooperate? But Brantley's expression darkened. Not good enough. Not even close. He released her hair only to grab her arm, twisting it behind her back with practiced cruelty. Camilla cried out, the joint screaming in protest, white-hot pain shooting up to her shoulder. Stop, please stop. Why should we? Brantley snarled into her ear. You didn't stop when we told you to mind your business. You kept waving those cops down like some kind of saint. Well, congratulations, you saved one piece of trash and now you get to pay for it. The world was narrowing to a pinpoint of pain and terror. Camilla couldn't think anymore, couldn't plan, couldn't do anything except endure. Her knees were buckling. Her vision was blurring. Somewhere distant, she heard the elderly woman crying, heard someone's chair scrape against the floor as they stood, then sat back down. No one was coming. No one ever came. Carson's hand moved to her throat, not squeezing but resting there, a promise of what could happen. Maybe we should take this outside. Finish what we started. What do you think, Brantley? I think... And then a voice cut through the diner like a knife through fog. Let her go. It wasn't loud. It wasn't aggressive. But it carried an authority that made the fluorescent lights seem to buzz louder, made the air feel heavier, made every person in the room inhale sharply at the same moment. Camilla's eyes snapped toward the source, toward the corner booth by the window, where a man in a black suit had risen to his feet. Damian Davila stood with the stillness of someone who had made a decision and wouldn't be swayed. His tattoos caught the afternoon light, dark ink against olive skin. His expression was calm, controlled, utterly unafraid. And beside him, the gray Pitbull had risen as well, every muscle in its body coiled and ready. Brantley's grip on Camilla loosened just slightly as he turned to face this interruption. His sneer was already forming, his confidence rebuilding. Who the hell are you supposed to be? Damian didn't answer. He simply stood there, immovable as stone. His dark eyes locked on Brantley and Carson with the kind of focus that made prey animals freeze in open fields. Carson's hand drifted toward his jacket, toward the reassuring weight hidden inside, and the Pitbull's ears flattened against its skull. Damian Davila had been sitting in that booth for 43 minutes, long enough to finish one cup of coffee, long enough to watch the shift change, the older waitress clocking out, the younger one with the burgundy uniform taking over the afternoon rush, long enough to catalog every exit, every blind spot, every person who walked through the door. It was a habit he couldn't break. 20 years in his line of work had burned it into his nervous system. Assess, observe, anticipate. The moment you stopped paying attention was the moment someone put a bullet in your spine or a knife between your ribs. So when the two men in leather jackets walked in, Damian noticed. Not because they looked particularly dangerous, plenty of men wore leather jackets. Not because they were loud or aggressive, they'd been quiet at first, almost polite, ordering coffee and sitting at the counter like regular customers. No, Damian noticed, because of the way they watched the waitress. Not with attraction, not with casual interest, with intent. Their eyes tracked her movements with the focus of hunters marking prey. When she disappeared into the kitchen, both men's heads turned to follow her path. When she returned with their coffee, one of them, the taller one with slicked-back dark hair, smiled at her in a way that made Damian's jaw tighten. He'd seen that smile before. On men who enjoyed inflicting pain. On men who confused power with strength and cruelty with dominance. At his feet, the Pitbull shifted slightly, sensing the change in Damian's breathing. The dog's name was Sombra Shadow, and she'd been with him for 4 years. Rescued from a fighting ring, half-starved and scarred, She'd learned to read him the way most people read books. She knew when he was relaxed. She knew when he was alert. And she knew when violence was coming. Damian scratched behind her ear absently, his eyes never leaving the two men. "Easy, girl," he murmured. "Not yet." Sombra settled but remained coiled, her dark eyes fixed on the men at the counter. For the next 20 minutes, Damian watched the scene develop with the grim inevitability of a slow-motion car crash. The men's body language shifted from casual to predatory. They moved from the counter to positions flanking the waitress, cutting off her escape routes. Their voices dropped to whispers meant only for her ears. And then her tray tilted, coffee spilling across the floor. Damian's hand stilled on Sombra's head. The waitress's voice cracked a sound of pure fear, and something old and cold settled into Damian's chest. He recognized that sound. He'd heard it in Medellin, in Ciudad Juarez, in a dozen blood-soaked cities where predators operated with impunity because everyone else was too afraid to intervene. He'd promised himself he was done with that life, done with violence, done with being the man who solved problems with broken bones and fear. But some promises were easier to make than to keep. "Let her go," he said quietly, more to himself than anyone else. Testing the words, feeling their weight. Sombra's ears pricked forward. The taller man, Brantley, he'd heard the other call him, shoved the waitress hard into the counter. She gasped, stumbling, her hip striking the edge with enough force to make Damian wince. The tray clattered to the floor, ceramic shattering, coffee spreading in dark pools across the checkered linoleum. And still, no one moved. No one helped. The entire diner had frozen into a collective paralysis, born of self-preservation and fear. Damian understood. He didn't blame them. Most people weren't built for violence. They went their entire lives without ever having to choose between their safety and someone else's suffering. That was a blessing, not a weakness. But Damian wasn't most people. He'd been 12 years old the first time he watched someone die. 14 when he first killed. By 20, he'd forgotten how to count. The cartel had taken him young, shaped him, forged him into something useful and terrible. He'd climbed their ranks through ruthlessness and intelligence, becoming the kind of man whose name was whispered with respect and fear in equal measure. Then he'd walked away. It had cost him everything, his family, his fortune, his identity. But he'd done it because he'd seen what that life turned people into, what it had turned him into. A machine that processed problems into corpses. For 5 years, he'd been clean, legitimate, invisible. He ran a small import business now, dealt in art and antiques, paid his taxes, kept his head down. He'd even started believing he could be normal. But normal men didn't have tattoos from the Sinaloa cartel crawling up their necks. Normal men didn't have a body count that required 3 digits to express. Normal men didn't sit in diners assessing threat levels and exit strategies out of pure instinct. And normal men didn't recognize the exact moment when restraint became complicity. Brantley grabbed the waitress's hair, yanking her head back viciously. She cried out a sound of pure anguish, and Damian felt something shift inside his chest. Not anger. Anger was hot and impulsive. This was colder, cleaner, the feeling of a decision being made at a level deeper than conscious thought. Carson's hand went to the waitress's throat, not squeezing yet, just resting there, a promise. Damian's own hand moved to the table, fingers spreading flat against the laminate. Sombra rose silently beside him, every muscle in her body tensed and ready. She didn't growl. She didn't need to. Her presence alone, compact, powerful, utterly focused, was a weapon. "Maybe we should take this outside," Carson was saying, his voice carrying false casualness. "Finish what we started." Damian stood. The movement was slow, deliberate, controlled. He unfolded from the booth with the economical grace of someone who had learned long ago not to waste motion. His black suit jacket hung perfectly on his frame, tailored to accommodate the muscle beneath. His hands, decorated with ink that told stories and symbols most people couldn't read, remained relaxed at his sides. But his eyes were ice. "Let her go," he said quietly. The words weren't a request. They weren't a suggestion. They were a statement of fact, a description of what was about to happen whether these men cooperated or not. Brantley turned, his sneer already forming. "Who the hell are you supposed to be?" Damian didn't answer. He simply stood there, centered and grounded, his gaze locked on Brantley with the kind of attention that predators reserved for threats. Beside him, Sombra's lips pulled back slightly, revealing teeth, and Carson's hand moved toward his jacket. Carson's fingers brushed the cold steel hidden inside his jacket. The weight of the gun was familiar, reassuring. He'd carried it for 3 years, a Glock 19, 15 rounds, cleaned and maintained religiously. It had gotten him out of tight spots before. It would get him out of this one. He glanced at Brantley, saw the same calculation happening behind his partner's eyes. They'd dealt with heroes before, good Samaritans who thought they could make a difference. They always backed down once they saw the gun. Always. This guy would be no different. "You should sit back down," Carson said, his voice hardening as his fingers closed around the grip. "This doesn't concern you." Damian's expression didn't change. He didn't flinch, didn't retreat, didn't show even a flicker of the fear Carson had expected to see. He just stood there, impossibly still, his dark eyes tracking Carson's hand movement with the precision of someone who had seen this dance 1,000 times before. "Let her go," Damian repeated, his voice still quiet, still controlled. "Last time I'll ask." Brantley laughed harsh and ugly. "Or what? You gonna sick your dog on us?" He finally released Camilla's hair, shoving her aside like discarded trash. She stumbled, catching herself against the counter, her breath coming in ragged sobs. "You got no idea who you're messing with, old man." "Neither do you," Damian said softly. Something in his tone made the elderly woman by the jukebox whimper, made the trucker at the counter set down his coffee cup with trembling hands, made every person in the diner suddenly desperate to be anywhere else. Carson pulled the gun free, letting it emerge from his jacket slowly, deliberately, so everyone could see. So this idiot in the suit would understand the reality of the situation. The barrel caught the afternoon light streaming through the windows, metal gleaming dull and deadly. "Last chance," Carson said, his confidence rebuilding with every second the gun remained in his hand. "Walk away. Forget you saw anything. We'll finish our business and leave." The Pitbull's growl started low, so low it was almost subsonic, a vibration that traveled through the floor and up through everyone's feet. It wasn't loud, but it was the kind of sound that triggered something primal in the human hindbrain, something left over from when our ancestors huddled in caves and feared the things that hunted in the dark. Sombra hadn't moved. She remained at Damian's side, muscles coiled, head lowered slightly, eyes locked on Carson with absolute focus. But that sound, that terrible, patient growl, promised violence beyond anything Carson had imagined. His hand wavered, just slightly, just enough. "You won't use that," Damian said, and it wasn't bravado or hope. It was certainty. "Because you're not ready to kill everyone in this diner. Not ready to explain the bodies to the police. Not ready for what comes after." Carson's finger moved to the trigger guard anyway, his jaw clenching. "You don't know what I'm ready for." "I know exactly what you're ready for." Damian took one step forward. Just one. But the space between them seemed to collapse, seemed to shrink into something intimate and terrible. "You're ready to intimidate, to threaten, to hurt someone weaker than you. But you're not ready for me." Brantley's sneer faltered. He looked at Carson, then at Damian, then at the dog that was somehow more terrifying than any weapon. "Carson, maybe we should—" "Shut up," Carson snapped, his voice cracking slightly. The gun rose higher, pointing now at Damian's chest. "I'm done talking. Sit down, or I swear to God." "You won't." 2 words, spoken with absolute conviction. And something in Carson broke. Maybe it was the pressure of the last 24 hours running from the cops, hiding in cheap motels, planning this revenge that was supposed to feel satisfying but just felt hollow. Maybe it was the way this stranger looked at him, not with fear but with something worse, pity. Or maybe it was just the animal part of his brain screaming that he'd made a terrible mistake. His hand shook. The gun barrel wavered. Damian moved. Not fast enough to seem superhuman. Not slow enough to seem careless. Just efficient. He closed the distance between them in a single fluid motion, his body angling away from the gun's line of fire even as his left hand came up and caught Carson's wrist. The movement was almost gentle, almost casual, like a teacher correcting a student's grip. Then Damian's thumb found the pressure point where Carson's wrist met his hand, and agony exploded up Carson's arm. His fingers spasmed open involuntarily, nerveless, and the gun clattered to the floor with a sound like a gavel striking wood. Carson tried to pull away, tried to strike out with his free hand, but Damian was already there, already moving, his body positioned in a way that made resistance impossible. A slight twist of the wrist Carson had been sure was his own, a small step to the side, and suddenly Carson was off balance, falling, his shoulder screaming as Damian controlled his descent with surgical precision. He hit the floor hard, face first, the air blasting from his lungs. Before he could even think about getting up, a weight settled onto his back, compact, powerful, unmistakable. Sombra had moved like liquid lightning, covering the distance in 3 silent bounds. Now she stood over Carson, her front paws pressed against his spine, her weight distributed in a way that kept him pinned without crushing him. Her face was inches from his neck, breath hot against his skin, that low growl continuing like an engine running at idle. Carson froze completely, terror flooding his system. He could feel her teeth not touching him, not yet, but there, close enough that any movement might trigger an attack he wouldn't survive. "Don't move," Damian said quietly. Not to Carson, to Brantley. Brantley had taken 2 steps toward them. His hands balled into fists, his face twisted with rage and fear and disbelief. But now he stopped, frozen like everyone else, watching his partner pinned beneath a dog that weighed maybe 60 pounds but seemed to carry the weight of mountains. "This is done," Damian said, his voice carrying to every corner of the diner. "It's over." Brantley's mouth opened, closed, his hands slowly uncurled. And Camilla, still pressed against the counter, watched through tears as the world tilted on its axis. For 3 eternal seconds, no one breathed. Carson lay frozen beneath Sombra's weight, his cheek pressed against the cold linoleum, coffee soaking into his jacket. The Pitbull's growl had stopped, but somehow the silence was worse. He could feel her muscles trembling not with fear or excitement, but with restraint, with the discipline of a weapon waiting for permission to fire. Brantley stood paralyzed 5 feet away, his brain struggling to process what had just happened. One moment Carson had the gun, one moment they had control, and then, nothing. Just emptiness where their power used to be. "Get up," Damian said quietly, his eyes never leaving Brantley. Slowly, it took Brantley a moment to realize the command was meant for him, not Carson. His legs felt disconnected from his body, his movements jerky and uncertain as he straightened from his aggressive stance. His hands remained at his sides, but they were shaking now, the tough guy confidence bleeding out of him like air from a punctured tire. Damian bent smoothly, picked up the fallen Glock with 2 fingers like it was contaminated, and ejected the magazine with practiced ease. The bullets clattered onto a nearby table, scattering across the surface. He cleared the chamber 1 round, spinning through the air, before landing among the salt and pepper shakers, then set the empty weapon on the counter, far from Carson's reach. The entire sequence took maybe 5 seconds, but it was performed with such casual competence, such absolute familiarity with firearms, that everyone watching understood something fundamental had shifted. This wasn't some random customer playing hero. This was someone who had handled guns so many times they'd become extensions of his hands. Someone who had disarmed threats the way other people tied their shoes. Someone dangerous. "Sombra," Damian said softly. "Heel." The Pitbull dismounted from Carson's back immediately, moving to Damian's left side and sitting with military precision. Her eyes remained fixed on both men, her body language still coiled and ready despite the command to stand down. Carson gasped, sucking in air, his ribs aching from where he'd hit the floor. He started to push himself up, and Damian's voice stopped him cold. "I didn't say you could move." Carson's arms locked. He stayed down, face still pressed to the floor, humiliation flooding through him hotter and more painful than any physical injury. Behind the counter, Camilla watched with wide, disbelieving eyes, her hand pressed to her mouth. Brantley found his voice, though it came out strangled and desperate. "You don't know what you're doing. You don't know who." "I know exactly who you are," Damian interrupted, his tone flat and emotionless. "Small-time enforcers. Maybe street soldiers if you're lucky. You hurt someone last night, this woman saw, and you came here for revenge because your pride couldn't handle being interrupted." Brantley's face went pale. "How did you—" "Because I've seen 1,000 versions of you." Damian took 1 step forward, and Brantley took 2 steps back, nearly tripping over a chair. Men who confuse brutality with strength, who think fear is the same as respect, who pick soft targets because anything else would expose how weak you really are. The words landed like physical blows. Brantley's hands curled into fists again, impotent rage flooding his features. "You don't know anything about us, about what we've done, what we're capable of. You're capable of beating an unarmed man in an alley," Damian said coldly. "Capable of terrorizing a waitress who weighs maybe 120 pounds. Capable of pulling a gun in a public place full of witnesses." He tilted his head slightly. "But you're not capable of following through. Because if you were, Carson would have pulled that trigger the moment I stood up." Carson flinched against the floor, the truth of it cutting deeper than any insult. "So here's what's going to happen," Damian continued, his voice dropping even lower, taking on a quality that made the temperature in the diner seem to plummet. "You're going to get up. You're going to walk out of here, and you're never going to come near this woman again." "Or what?" Brantley spat, trying desperately to salvage some shred of dignity. "You gonna kill us? In front of all these witnesses?" Damian smiled then, just a slight curve of his lips entirely without warmth. "I don't need to kill you. I just need to make sure you understand the cost of coming back." He moved with sudden, controlled violence. 3 strides closed the distance to Brantley, who barely had time to raise his hands before Damian caught his right wrist and twisted not enough to break, but enough to send lightning bolts of pain up Brantley's arm. Brantley cried out, stumbling forward, and Damian guided him down into a chair with the same surgical precision he'd used on Carson. "Look at me," Damian commanded. Brantley looked, his eyes wide and watering with pain. "I spent 15 years in Sinaloa," Damian said quietly, his face inches from Brantley's. 15 years learning exactly how to hurt people, how to break them, how to make them disappear so completely their own mothers couldn't identify the pieces. He paused, letting the words sink in. "I walked away from that life because I got tired of what it turned me into. But I remember every technique, every method, every lesson." Brantley's face had gone gray. His breath came in short, panicked gasps. "If you come near her again," Damian continued, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper, "I will forget why I left. I will remember who I was. And you will learn the difference between the violence you play at and the violence I perfected." He released Brantley's wrist, and the man slumped in the chair, all the fight gone from him, replaced by something primal and absolute. "Fear." Damian straightened, turned to where Carson still lay on the floor. "Get up, take your friend, leave." Carson scrambled to his feet, his legs nearly giving out beneath him. He stumbled toward Brantley, pulling him up by the arm, both of them moving like broken puppets. They made it 3 steps toward the door before Damian spoke again. "The gun stays. And if I hear you've hurt anyone else, anyone at all, I'll find you." Neither man looked back. They just ran, the door slamming behind them, leaving only silence and the fading echo of their fear. Damian stood in the center of the diner, surrounded by stunned witnesses, and slowly exhaled. Then he turned to Camilla. The diner remained frozen in the aftermath. No one moved, no one spoke. The only sounds were the faint hum of the refrigerator behind the counter, and Camilla's ragged breathing as she pressed herself against the wall, her hands still trembling, her burgundy uniform dark with spilled coffee and sweat. Damian watched the door for a long moment, his body still coiled with readiness, listening for the sound of returning footsteps or engines starting. But there was nothing, just the empty street beyond the glass, the afternoon sun casting long shadows across the parking lot. Brantley and Carson were gone, and they wouldn't be coming back. He knew their type. They would run until their legs gave out, would find the nearest hole to crawl into, would spend the next week looking over their shoulders and jumping at shadows. Men like that, men who built their confidence on intimidation and preyed on the helpless, crumbled completely when confronted by someone who understood violence at a deeper level than they could imagine. They were done, finished, broken. Damian turned slowly, his eyes sweeping across the diner. The elderly couple by the jukebox sat perfectly still, the woman's hand clutched in her husband's, both of them staring at him with expressions caught between gratitude and terror. The trucker at the counter had both hands flat on the surface, palms down, like he was afraid any movement might draw attention. The businessman near the restrooms had his phone out but hadn't dialed, hadn't filmed, hadn't done anything except bear witness. And in the center of it all stood Camilla, looking like she might collapse at any moment. Damian took 1 step toward her, and she flinched. The movement was small, just a slight recoil, a tightening of her shoulders, but it hit him harder than any of Carson's attempted blows could have. She was still afraid, not of Brantley and Carson anymore, but of him, of the violence she'd just witnessed, of what he'd revealed himself to be. "I'm not going to hurt you," Damian said quietly, keeping his distance, keeping his hands visible and relaxed at his sides. Sombra remained sitting at his heel, her posture shifting from combat-ready to something softer, something closer to the therapy dog demeanor she'd been trained for in the months after he'd rescued her. Camilla's eyes were wide, bloodshot from crying, her mascara streaked down her cheeks in dark lines. Who are you?" It was a complicated question, with no simple answer. Damian Davila had been many things: enforcer, executioner, lieutenant in an organization that controlled territories the way governments controlled countries. He'd been feared across 3 states and 2 countries, his name spoken in whispers, his reputation built on a foundation of blood and broken promises. But that was before. That was the man he'd buried 5 years ago. Someone who doesn't like bullies, he said instead, offering the simplest truth he could. Camilla's laugh came out wet and broken. That's not an answer. It's the only one that matters right now. Damian glanced at the gun, still sitting on the counter, the scattered bullets on the nearby table. Do you have a manager here? Someone who should know what happened? She nodded jerkily. Tom, he's in the back office. He's probably... Her voice cracked. He probably heard everything. Then he'll call the police, Damian said, more statement than question. Panic flashed across Camilla's face. The police? But they'll want statements, and questions, and... She looked at him with sudden understanding. You don't want to talk to the police. Damian didn't answer, but his silence was confirmation enough. She straightened slightly, wiping at her face with shaking hands. Because of what you said. About Sinaloa. About... She couldn't finish the sentence. Because I left that life behind, Damian said quietly. And talking to police means risking someone recognizing my name, running it through databases, asking questions I don't want to answer. So you're just going to leave? There was something in her voice, not quite accusation, but close. Just walk away like nothing happened? Yes. The bluntness of it seemed to surprise her. She stared at him for a long moment, her expression cycling through confusion, anger, and something that might have been disappointment. Why did you even help me then, if you're just going to disappear? It was another complicated question. Damian could have told her about the promises he'd made to himself when he walked away from the cartel, about trying to balance the scales, to find redemption in small acts of protection that could never erase what he'd done but might somehow make the weight slightly more bearable. But those were his burdens to carry, not hers. Because you needed help, he said simply. And no one else was going to give it. Something in Camilla's expression shifted. The fear didn't disappear, he could still see it in the tension around her eyes, in the way she kept one hand braced against the counter, but it was joined by something else. Recognition, maybe, or understanding. Thank you, she whispered. The words felt inadequate for what had just happened, but Damian nodded anyway. You did nothing wrong. Last night, when you called for help that took courage, don't let them make you think otherwise. Tears welled in her eyes again. But this time they weren't born entirely of fear. I thought I was going to die. I thought no one would stop them. Someone always stops them, Damian said. Eventually, from the back of the diner, a door burst open. A middle-aged man in a grease-stained shirt emerged, his face red and panicked. Camilla! Are you Jesus Christ? What happened out here? His eyes swept across the scene, the spilled coffee, the broken ceramic, the gun on the counter, the scattered bullets before landing on Damian with sudden suspicion. Who the hell are you? Someone who was leaving, Damian said evenly. The manager's eyes narrowed. Like hell you are. You're staying right there until the cops. Tom, no, Camilla interrupted, her voice stronger than it had been moments before. He helped me. Those men, they were going to... She couldn't finish, but she didn't need to. The evidence was written across her tear-stained face, her stained uniform, her trembling hands. Tom's expression shifted from suspicion to confusion, to something approaching understanding. The guys who ran out? They were? They're gone, Camilla said firmly, and he made sure they won't come back. Tom looked between them, clearly struggling with the decision. Finally, he sighed heavily. I'm still calling the police. There's a gun here, for Christ's sake. But, he looked at Damian. Give me 5 minutes before I dial. It was more grace than Damian deserved. He nodded once, then turned toward his booth. Damian moved toward his booth with the same controlled efficiency he'd displayed throughout the confrontation. No rushing, no theatrics, just purposeful steps that carried him back to where his coffee sat cold and forgotten, where his world had been simple and quiet before violence had called him back into the light. Sombra followed at his heel. Her body language relaxed now, the combat readiness fading into something gentler. She'd done her job perfectly, controlled aggression, disciplined restraint, the perfect balance between protection and restraint that he'd spent months training into her after the rescue. He reached for his jacket, draped across the back of the booth, simple black leather, worn soft from years of use. Expensive once, but now just comfortable. His fingers closed around the material, and he turned back toward the center of the diner. Camilla was still pressed against the counter, her arms wrapped around herself, shaking like a leaf in a storm. The adrenaline was crashing now, leaving her system in a flood that made her knees weak and her vision blur. Tom had moved to her side, speaking in low, soothing tones, but she barely heard him. All she could focus on was the cold that had seeped into her bones. Not from temperature, the diner was warm, almost stuffy, but from shock. From the bone-deep understanding of how close she'd come to something terrible. Damian approached slowly, reading her body language, giving her space to refuse his proximity. When he was close enough to speak without the entire diner hearing, he stopped. "May I?" he asked quietly, indicating the jacket. Camilla looked at him with confusion clouding her tear-streaked face. "What?" "You're in shock," Damian said simply. "Your body temperature is dropping. This will help." Before she could respond, before she could process whether she wanted help from someone who had just casually dismantled two armed men, he stepped forward and draped the jacket across her shoulders with surprising gentleness. The leather was still warm from his body heat, still carried the faint scent of expensive cologne and something else, coffee, maybe, or the peculiar smell of well-maintained firearms. The weight of it settled across her shoulders like an anchor, grounding her, pulling her back from the edge of the panic spiral she'd been teetering on. "I can't," she started, her hands coming up automatically to remove it. "This is yours. I shouldn't." "Keep it," Damian said. His voice was different now, softer, lacking the edge of command that had cut through the diner minutes ago. "At least until you stop shaking." Camilla's hands stilled on the lapels. She looked down at the jacket, at her own trembling fingers, and something inside her cracked, not broke, just opened, like a dam releasing pressure it could no longer contain. The sob came from somewhere deep in her chest, ragged and raw, then another. Then she was crying in earnest, her whole body shaking with the force of emotions she'd been holding back since the moment Brantley and Carson had walked through the door. "I'm sorry," she gasped between sobs. "I'm sorry, I can't." "Don't apologize," Damian said quietly. "You survived. That's what matters." Tom had backed away slightly, giving them space, his own expression twisted with guilt and helplessness. The other patrons remained frozen, uncertain whether to approach or give privacy, trapped in the awkward space between compassion and self-preservation. Camilla pulled the jacket tighter around herself, using it like a shield, like armor against the world. "I thought I was going to die," she whispered. "I thought they were going to—" The words caught in her throat, too terrible to speak aloud. "But they didn't," Damian said, and there was something in his tone, not quite comfort but certainty. Absolute, unshakable certainty. "And they never will. What I told them wasn't a bluff. If they come near you again, I'll know. And I'll finish what I started." She looked up at him then, really looked at him. Past the tattoos and the stillness and the violence she'd witnessed, and what she saw surprised her. His eyes weren't cold anymore. They were tired. Old in a way that had nothing to do with age, and everything to do with the weight of things seen and done. There was regret there, buried deep beneath layers of control and discipline, and something else, something that looked almost like recognition. He saw himself in her, she realized. Saw someone who had done the right thing and been punished for it. Someone who had tried to help and found themselves marked for retribution. "You did the right thing last night," Damian continued, his voice quiet enough that only she could hear. "Calling for help, refusing to look away. That took more courage than anything I did today." "It didn't feel like courage," Camilla said bitterly. "It felt like stupidity. Look where it got me. It got you here. Alive. Standing." Damian glanced toward the door, toward the empty street beyond. "Those men wanted you to regret helping that person in the alley. Wanted you to feel like kindness was a mistake. Don't give them that. But they found me. And I found them," Damian interrupted gently. "The world isn't only full of predators, Camilla. Sometimes there are people watching. People who step in when the line gets crossed." She wanted to believe him. Wanted to believe that somewhere in the chaos and cruelty of the world, there were still people who would stand between the helpless and the wolves. But it was hard. So hard. "What if they come back?" she whispered. "They won't." "How can you be sure?" Damian's expression shifted slightly, something dark flickering behind his eyes. "Because I know men like them. I used to be one of them, or worse. I know exactly what breaks them. And they're broken now. Completely." The admission hung in the air between them, heavy and honest. Camilla should have been more afraid, should have recoiled from the casual way he acknowledged his past. But instead, she felt something strange. Safety. This man, this dangerous, violent, tattooed stranger, had protected her when no one else would, had put himself between her and harm without hesitation, without asking for anything in return. And now he was standing here, giving her his jacket, speaking to her like she mattered. "Thank you," she said again, and this time the words carried more weight, more meaning. "I don't know how to I can't thank you. Damian nodded once, accepting the gratitude without false modesty or deflection. You're welcome. From the back office, they heard Tom's voice rising slightly, the sound of him dialing, speaking to someone on the phone. The police would be here soon. Questions would be asked. Statements would be taken. And Damian needed to be gone before that happened. I have to go, he said quietly. Camilla's hands tightened on the jacket. Will I see you again? It was a strange question to ask a stranger. But he didn't feel like a stranger anymore. He felt like the only solid thing in a world that had tried to shake her apart. Damian was quiet for a moment, considering. I come here sometimes, he said finally. For the coffee, for the quiet. It wasn't a promise. But it wasn't a refusal either. Keep the jacket, he added. Consider it a reminder. Of what? His lips curved into something that wasn't quite a smile but was close. That someone was watching, and that you're stronger than you think. Before she could respond, he turned and walked toward the door, Sombra moving silently beside him. His hand was on the handle when Camilla called out, What's your name? He paused, half-turned, his profile sharp against the afternoon light streaming through the windows. Damian. Then he was gone, the door closing softly behind him, leaving nothing but the lingering warmth of his jacket and the profound silence of a diner full of people trying to process what they'd just witnessed. Camilla stood there, wrapped in leather that smelled like safety, and finally let herself breathe. The diner didn't return to normal immediately. For several long minutes after Damian walked out, everyone remained frozen in their positions, as if afraid that moving too quickly might somehow rewind time and bring the violence back. The elderly woman by the jukebox was crying softly, her husband's arm around her shoulders, both of them staring at the space where the confrontation had unfolded, like it was a stage that might come alive again at any moment. The trucker at the counter finally moved, his hand shaking as he lifted his coffee cup to his lips. He took a sip, grimaced when he realized it had gone cold, and set it back down with a soft clink that seemed too loud in the heavy silence. Tom emerged from the back office, his face pale and drawn. Police are on their way, they said. He paused, looking at Camilla with something between concern and helplessness. They said not to touch anything, to preserve the scene. Camilla laughed, a broken, hysterical sound that didn't match the situation. The scene. Like this is a crime show. She pulled Damian's jacket tighter around her shoulders, drawing comfort from its weight. What do I even tell them? The truth, Tom said, though he didn't sound entirely convinced himself. 2 men came in. They threatened you. Another customer intervened. He glanced at the gun, still sitting on the counter, at the scattered bullets on the table. They'll have questions about him, though. About where he went. He left, Camilla said flatly. That's all I know. It wasn't entirely true. She knew his name. She knew about Sinaloa, about the 15 years he'd spent learning violence, about the life he'd walked away from. But those were his secrets to keep, his burdens to carry. And after what he'd done for her, she owed him at least that much. Tom nodded slowly, seeming to understand what she wasn't saying. Okay, we'll keep it simple then. The businessman near the restrooms finally put his phone away and stood, moving toward the counter with careful, measured steps. I saw everything, he said quietly. If the police need a witness statement, I can confirm what happened. Those men were the aggressors. That other man, he was defending her. Me too, the trucker added, his voice rough. I saw it all. They had her cornered, had a gun. That guy just stopped them. One by one, the other patrons added their voices. The elderly couple, the young woman in the corner booth who Camilla hadn't even noticed was there. The cook, still standing in the kitchen window with his spatula forgotten in his hand. They had all watched, all frozen in fear. But now, in the aftermath, they were willing to speak, to make sure the story was told correctly, to ensure that Camilla wouldn't face this alone. Something loosened in her chest, a knot of isolation she hadn't realized had formed. She wasn't alone. These people had been paralyzed by fear, yes, but they weren't indifferent. They cared. They would stand with her when it mattered. Thank you, she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. All of you. Thank you. Tom squeezed her shoulder gently. Why don't you sit down? You've been standing this whole time. You must be exhausted. Camilla nodded numbly and moved toward the nearest booth, not the one Damian had occupied, that felt too sacred somehow, but one close by. She slid into the vinyl seat, and immediately her legs began to shake violently, the adrenaline finally draining from her system completely. The cook disappeared into the kitchen and returned moments later with a glass of water and a clean dishcloth. For your face, he said gruffly, setting both on the table. And drink the water, all of it. She obeyed mechanically, wiping away the mascara streaks, the tears, the evidence of her terror. The water was cold and clean, and it helped settle her stomach, helped pull her back into her body. Outside, sirens wailed in the distance, growing closer. Camilla's hands tightened around the glass. The police. They would want to know everything. They would ask about Brantley and Carson, about what they'd said, about why they'd targeted her. And she would have to tell them about the alley, about the man being beaten, about how she'd called for help and inadvertently painted a target on her own back. She would have to relive it all again. But as the sirens grew louder and the first patrol car pulled into the parking lot, Camilla realized something that surprised her. She wasn't afraid anymore. Oh, she was shaken, traumatized. Her hands still trembled and her breath still came too fast, and she knew she wouldn't sleep properly for days. But the bone-deep terror that had gripped her since last night, the certainty that she was hunted, that nowhere was safe, that her act of courage had doomed her, that was gone. Because Damian had been right. Someone had been watching. Someone had stepped in, and the wolves who had come for her had been driven away, broken, and terrified themselves. The world wasn't only full of predators. 2 officers entered the diner, their hands resting on their belts, their eyes scanning the scene with professional assessment. They took in the spilled coffee, the broken ceramic, the gun on the counter, before their gazes settled on Camilla. "Ma'am," the older officer said, his voice calm and measured. "I'm Officer Harry. This is Officer Bruce. We received a call about an incident here. Are you injured?" Camilla shook her head. "No. I'm okay. Can you tell us what happened?" And so she did. Slowly at first, then with growing confidence as the other patrons added their observations, their confirmations, their support. She told them about the alley, about witnessing the assault, about calling for the police. She told them about coming to work today and being confronted by the 2 men who had been beating that victim. She told them about the gun, about the threats, about believing she was going to die. And she told them about Damian. Not everything. Not about Sinaloa or his past or the darkness she'd glimpsed behind his controlled exterior. Just that a customer had intervened, that he'd disarmed one man and restrained both, that he'd made them leave and told them never to come back. "This customer," Officer Harry said, his pen poised over his notepad. "Did you get his name?" Camilla hesitated for just a fraction of a second. "Damian. He said his name was Damian. Last name. He didn't say. And where is he now?" "He left, right before you arrived." She looked the officer directly in the eye. "He saved my life. Those men were going to hurt me, maybe kill me, and he stopped them. Without him, I don't know what would have happened." Officer Harry's expression softened slightly. "We'll need to speak with him. Get his statement. Do you know how we can reach him?" "No. I'd never seen him before today." Another small lie, but necessary. "He just helped, then left." The officer didn't look entirely satisfied, but he nodded and made a note. They would search for Damian, of course, would run the name through their databases, would try to piece together who he was. But Camilla suspected they wouldn't find much. Someone who had spent 15 years in the Sinaloa cartel and walked away would know how to disappear. The questions continued for another 30 minutes. They collected the gun, photographed the scene, took statements from every witness. They asked if Camilla wanted to file formal charges against Brantley and Carson, and she said yes without hesitation. Finally, Officer Harry closed his notepad. "We'll be in touch if we have more questions, and we'll increase patrols in this area. If those men come back." "They won't," Camilla said with absolute certainty. The officer raised an eyebrow. "How can you be sure?" Camilla thought about the way Damian had looked at Brantley and Carson, the cold promise in his voice, the absolute authority in his posture. "I just am," she said quietly. The patrol cars eventually pulled away, their taillights disappearing into the late afternoon traffic. Officer Harry had left his card on the table, told Camilla to call if she remembered anything else or if she felt unsafe. Tom had offered to drive her home, told her she could take the rest of the week off, said the diner would cover any counseling she might need. The other patrons had slowly filtered out, each one pausing to offer words of support, to squeeze her hand, to promise they'd be there if the police needed more statements. And now Camilla sat alone in the booth, still wrapped in Damian's jacket, watching the sunlight slant through the windows and paint everything gold. The diner felt different now. The same vinyl booths, the same checkered floor, the same fluorescent lights humming overhead, but all of it transformed by what had happened within these walls, like a baptism by violence that had washed away whatever innocence this place had pretended to hold. Tom approached with a fresh pot of coffee and 2 cups. He slid into the booth across from her without asking permission, poured for both of them, and pushed 1 cup across the table. "You don't have to stay," he said quietly. "I can handle closing up." Camilla wrapped her hands around the warm ceramic, letting the heat seep into her palms. "I know, but I think I need to be here for a little while longer. Does that make sense?" Tom nodded. "Yeah, it does." He took a sip of his coffee, his eyes distant. "I should have come out sooner. When I heard the commotion, I was in the back counting inventory and I heard voices getting loud, but I thought it was just..." He stopped, shook his head. "I should have come out." "You called the police," Camilla said. "That's what mattered. That guy Damian, he didn't wait for the police. He just acted." Tom's expression was complicated, caught between admiration and something that might have been shame. "I've been running this diner for 12 years. I tell myself I look out for my people. But when it mattered, I froze." "Everyone froze," Camilla said softly. "It's not you can't blame yourself for that. Can't I?" Tom met her eyes. "What if he hadn't been here? What if it had just been us normal people who don't know how to fight, who've never had to make that choice? Would we have just watched while they..." He couldn't finish the sentence. Camilla didn't have an answer, because she'd been asking herself the same question since the moment Damian walked out the door. What if he hadn't been there? What if the universe hadn't placed exactly the right person in exactly the right booth at exactly the right time? She wanted to believe someone else would have intervened eventually, that the trucker or the businessman or even Tom would have found the courage to step in. But she'd seen their faces, seen the fear that had paralyzed them. And she understood it, because she'd felt it too, that primal certainty that getting involved meant becoming a target yourself. Most people weren't built for violence. Most people went their entire lives without having to choose between their safety and someone else's suffering. That was normal. That was human. But some people were different. Some people had walked through fire so many times they'd stopped feeling the heat. "He was here," Camilla said finally. "That's what matters. He was here, and he helped, and I'm alive because of it." Tom nodded slowly, but the weight of his guilt didn't seem to lift. "I'm giving you 2 weeks paid leave. Non-negotiable. You need time to process this. To heal." "I can't afford..." "It's paid," Tom repeated firmly. "And when you come back, if you come back, we're installing a panic button behind the counter. Should have done it years ago." He paused. "And I'm signing us up for that self-defense workshop the community center runs. All staff, on the clock." It was a small thing. Probably wouldn't make a difference if something like this happened again. But it was something. An acknowledgement that the world wasn't as safe as they'd pretended it was. That preparation wasn't paranoia. That sometimes, the wolves really did come. Camilla took a sip of her coffee, letting the bitter warmth ground her. Through the window, she could see people walking past on the sidewalk, oblivious, absorbed in their phones and conversations, living their lives without any idea what had happened inside this building just an hour ago. The world kept turning, kept moving forward, indifferent to individual suffering or salvation. But that wasn't entirely true, was it? Because somewhere out there, Damian was walking with his Pitbull, carrying whatever weight he'd accumulated over 15 years in Sinaloa. He'd stopped running from his past long enough to protect a stranger, had risked exposure, had risked bringing attention to himself, because someone needed help and no one else was going to give it. That meant something. That meant the world wasn't only indifferent. That scattered throughout the masses of people who looked away, who froze, who chose safety over intervention. There were others, watchers, protectors, people who had seen enough darkness to recognize it instantly and had decided, for whatever reason, that they wouldn't let it win without a fight. The door chimed, and Camilla's head snapped up, her heart rate spiking instantly. But it was just the elderly couple from earlier, the ones who had been sitting by the jukebox. They moved slowly toward the counter, the woman clutching her purse, the man's hand steady on her elbow. "We forgot to pay," the woman said, her voice trembling slightly. "With everything that happened, we just forgot." Tom waved them off. "Don't worry about it. On the house." "No," the man said firmly. He pulled out his wallet, extracted 2 20s, and placed them on the counter. "For the meal." And he added 2 more 20s. "For her," he nodded toward Camilla. "For having the courage to help someone last night. For being the kind of person who doesn't look away. The woman stepped forward, her eyes bright with tears. My grandson, he was mugged last year, beaten badly, and people walked past. Dozens of people, and not one stopped to help. She reached out and took Camilla's hand. What you did calling for help when you saw someone in trouble that matters. Don't ever think it doesn't. Camilla's throat tightened, words failing her. She could only nod as the elderly woman squeezed her hand once more before turning to leave with her husband. The money sat on the counter, more than any tip she'd ever received, more than the couple's meal had cost. It wasn't about the amount. It was about acknowledgement, about being seen, about knowing that her choice to help, even when it had cost her so dearly, had meant something to someone. Tom picked up the bills and brought them to the booth, setting them in front of her. She's right, you know. What you did took real courage. It didn't feel like courage, Camilla said quietly. It felt like instinct. Like I couldn't not do it. That's what courage is, Tom replied. Doing the right thing even when every instinct is screaming at you to run. They sat in companionable silence for a while, drinking their coffee, watching the afternoon fade into early evening. The diner's neon sign flickered to life outside, casting red and blue shadows across the parking lot. Eventually, Camilla shrugged out of Damian's jacket and folded it carefully, her fingers lingering on the worn leather. She would keep it safe, would hold on to it like a talisman, a reminder of the day she'd learned that sometimes, not always, but sometimes someone was watching. I think I'm ready to go home now, she said softly. Tom nodded and stood, offering his hand to help her out of the booth. As they walked toward the door, Camilla paused and looked back at the corner booth by the window. The one where Damian had sat, the one where he'd positioned himself to see the entire diner, to watch for threats, to be ready. She wondered if he'd chosen that booth deliberately, if he always sat where he could see everything, observe everyone, prepared to intervene if the moment required it. She suspected he did. And she wondered how many other people had been saved by his watchfulness, how many threats he'd neutralized before they could fully form, how many times he'd stepped between the helpless and the wolves without anyone even knowing. Some people survived because they were lucky. Others survived because they were brave enough to call for help when they saw injustice. And some survived because somewhere, in a booth by the window or a corner of a room or a shadowed doorway, someone dangerous was watching someone who had decided that whatever darkness lived in their past, they would use it to cast light for others. Camilla stepped out into the evening air, Tom's hand steady on her elbow, and felt the weight of fear finally begin to lift. The wolves had come for her, but someone had been watching, and she was still here, still standing, still alive. That was enough. Thanks for staying with this story right till the final moment. You're the reason these stories come alive. If you're ready for another powerful journey, just tap the next video on your screen. And before you go, leave a quick comment and rate this story from 1 to 10. I'm excited to see your thoughts and connect with you down there.